First of all, I appreciate you all being here. We're starting with the invitation that we can actually package it easier afterwards, the video. But I appreciate you taking the time of both participating as panelists for this panel, but also to the attendees coming today. It's really my pleasure to have with me a series of key experts and friends. Some of them I've known for quite a few years, from experts on ESG certification, especially in the mining sector. So I have this, as you can see on the invitation, we have Aimee Boulanger, who's Executive Director from the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. We also have Michèle Brülhart, Executive Director for the Copper Mark, Peter Sinclair, Senior Advisor for the World Gold Council, and Ben Chalmers, who's actually from the Mining Association of Canada and the Mining Association of Canada, having issued this program, the Towards Sustainable Mining Initiative, very early, that will hopefully join us very soon on this webinar. I just wanted to reconfirm and just mention a few notes. First of all, we abide here by Chatham House standards. What does that mean? That means that this conversation is really informal. We actually are going to be talking about issues that would be obviously of interest to ESG and the mining sector, but also try to answer some of your questions. We're just asking that you don't quote the people from this panel, and so that we can maintain a very strong level of informality and open conversation. This is a webinar which is part of and I see that Ben is joining us right now. Ben is so gallant that he wanted every Aimee and Michèle to appear first. That's why. Hi Ben, nice to see you.
Hi, apologies. I was on a call
okay, don't worry.
and didn't realize what time it was.
We're just starting. So I was saying that this webinar is part of the Amberley Advisory webinar series that we have dedicated to sharing best practices in ESG in the mining sector and energy sector. So as some of you know, but again, you feel free to reach out for additional links to past webinar. We worked on issues such as indigenous relation with indigenous communities, green powering of mines, community consents for projects, local content, and shared value towards inclusive development in different mining territories. So all those issues we feel are very important to continue being part of raising attention to those issues, raising awareness, and sharing perspective from across the board. And here, what I thought was very important, and we always try to have on indigenous communities, representative First Nations, mining companies, and others. But here, I thought it was very interesting to have a debate on these, debate or conversation, open conversation on those ESG certifications initiatives with a series of key institutional organizations that represent different, angle and perspective on this topic. And I want to just as an introduction to just also confirm that, please, if you want to ask a question, just write it in the chat. We actually want this to be as interactive as possible, but we have tried to have some kind of a conversation that will be first presenting, those different institution and certification standards and scheme, because I think it's important for you to have a good presentation on each one of them, and then a series of questions on key topics such as how to conduct on-site assessment, or how to be able to pursue and implement best practices. So first of all, again, I want to thank our panelists from being here. And maybe just to start the conversation, Ben, you are the last one arriving, but you're the first one I'm actually going to be picking on, because I thought it was very interesting to get the perspective from the Mining Association of Canada, from the Towards Sustainable Mining Certification Initiative, because it was the first of its kind, if I understand well. And you actually demand that companies that are member of the association implement TSM, not only in Canada, but you're starting also to have an outreach internationally. So maybe if I can turn to you, Ben, and maybe allow us to understand better, TSM shortly, and I'll try to lead you on the conversation.
Sure, thanks, Remi. And again, apologies for joining just a few minutes late, but I'm very happy to be here. You're right, TSM was the first of these standards to become operational at the mine site level. We launched the standard in 2004 and began publicly reporting on externally verified results in 2006. So, we're into our 15th year now of independently verified public reporting of sustainability results. And we've learned a lot over that time. And one of the interesting things about it is that when we first started TSM, it was at a time before conversations around standards and performance with investors and with our customers. And the motivations for why we did this were completely different. And we've managed to hold on to those motivations today. And those motivations really were to, first and foremost, give the information to the mine sites, to the practitioners of the mine sites, to help them drive their performance, to help them do better in the areas of community engagement and tailings and safety and the other areas that are covered by our standard and those of my colleagues on the call today. And then, of course, also one of the critical things about being a mine site level standard, which was unique back then and less so today, is that by disaggregating the data by mine site, you also give the information to affected communities who can use that to know that their mines in their backyards are being operated to certain levels of standards. I think TSM is a little different than some of the other standards in that it's not quite as broad as the other standards. It focuses on a more narrow set of issues. But I think what's interesting about that to me is that those issues are the result of a collaboration between the industry that comes together to decide what good practice and leadership looks like in these standards, but to do so in conjunction with national stakeholders. So one of the components of TSM is that each country, each national association that adopts it, and there are 10 of us now on 6 continents, is required to establish one of these multi-stakeholder dialogue tables. And so it's the industry working with national stakeholders and national rights holders that are able to focus on what are the most urgent priorities for shifting performance in the industry. So for example, when the mining associations in Finland and Argentina joined, they said, look, we need a mine closure standard because they had both countries have very little in the way of mine closure regulations, unlike we do in Canada. So they added that to their list of standards to say this is for TSM to do what it needs to do in our countries, we need this extra standard. We've worked hard to scale TSM up, and you pointed in your introductory comments there to the fact that one of the unique values that we bring to a national industry when it joins TSM is that requirement that the National Association establish it as a condition of membership. So when you're a member of Mining Association of Canada or Finmin in Finland or CAIM in Argentina or the Mineral Council of Australia, as they move towards implementation, they are required to make this a condition of membership to publicly report and undertake verification. So it will scale up in these countries very quickly.
And talking indeed on having collaboration with other countries, having TSM being implemented in different geographies. I know we have a series of people in attendance that are from Brazil and Colombia, because we're very present in Latin America, and you just have the implementation of an agreement with the Agencia Colombiana de Minería. What does that mean, therefore, for mining companies that are discovering TSM, will have to report specifically, and maybe how do you help other national mining association to socialize the TSM framework and to then maybe accompany them towards being able to report efficiently and learning from the other companies that have done it in Canada more since a larger amount of time. That was a long way to explain it.
That's great. Over the last few years, we've gotten quite good at this. We have a fairly comprehensive support package that we share with our partner associations. It includes online training, webinar training, in-person training when we're able to get back to that, of course. We have a wealth of history and knowledge of interpretation that we share with them. Basically, the commitment from us is that we share TSM freely with these other national associations. We have a standard licensing agreement, a cooperation agreement, as we call it, that gives them access to TSM intellectual property. There's no fee associated with it, and we provide our time to help them. To help them learn how to use the program, to help them establish their multi-stakeholder dialogue tables. In fact, we were just on a call with the National Mining Association the other day in the US, talking about what this could look like if they were to take it on. We often have some of our own stakeholder panel, our community of interest panels, some of our Indigenous representatives or others work with these stakeholder networks in the other countries to help. So it's not just bringing mining professional expertise. It's also bringing expertise of Canadian stakeholders and rights holders that have been involved in TSM for a long time to bring their knowledge to these countries as well and help advance the conversations around sustainable mining there.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. And maybe using, as I was mentioning, Colombia as a country which has a lot of developing projects in copper, that kind of brings my transition to Michèle. You also, you know, an institution that has a very interesting framework of assurance, which is on-site based. Can you maybe give us more perspective, especially, I mean, to the attention of copper mining companies listening?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me here. It's great to
see pleasure, really.
my old friends and colleagues here from our various standards organizations. Always nice to see some familiar and friendly faces. Look, so we're the youngest organization in this group, the baby, so to speak. And so we're always confronted with the question of why did we need the copper mark? Didn't we already have enough of these standards? So I'm gonna try maybe just to give you a little bit of perspective on where we came from and who we are. The Copper Mark is an organization that was initiated and led by the copper industry, but has been spun out of the Copper Association about 1.5 years ago now as a separate entity, and slowly but surely transitioning to a more multi-stakeholder governed organization. So we've come quite some way in terms of opening up our organization to various stakeholders, various perspectives, linking both along the supply chain and across different types of stakeholders with civil society, making stronger linkages also to local organizations and communities to increase their voice in the work that we're doing. I think Aimee is certainly going to give us more insight in the value that can bring to a standard system and how it can strengthen what we're trying to achieve here in moving us forward. So as I said, we've been around for about 1.5 years, and I think what to some extent influenced the building of the Copper Mark is the idea of the value chain and the idea to convene around the specific metal, to have the ability to really focus and deep dive on the salient issues that this industry is faced with today. And you know, you've alluded to new projects coming on board, and the increasing demand for copper that we are forecasting here. So really, you know, what are these issues that the copper industry specifically needs to tackle along the supply chain? So when we started last year, we were really focused on the production side, so mining, but also smelting and refining. But there's always been the vision, and this is kind of phase 2 or version 2.0 of the Copper Mark by 2023, to also include the fabrication stage, to explicitly address recycled copper streams and supply chains. And so again, really looking at not just what does responsible mining of copper look like, but what does responsible copper supply chains look like, and how do you translate that across those different layers? Because we're kind of the baby in this round, we've had the huge advantage of learning from all these different systems and building on all this different work. So I think we're going to come back probably to this conversation, as always, with different standard system, right? How do you build on what companies have already implemented? How do we recognize the different standard systems and work that's already been conducted? So the Copper Mark has built in our DNA, so to speak, the concept of equivalence and cross-recognition. We recognize at the mining level the big standards that are on the call here today, as well as others. We've operationalized these equivalencies with our participants already. Complicated way of saying we've already had sites that participate in the Copper Mark that used another standard to demonstrate conformance. And so we're working with them to say, well, here is a couple of additional questions you may need to ask, or we may have some additional expectations on-site assessments or how the assurance needs to be conducted. But we work with the participants to make sure that you can either use the Copper Mark as the guiding standard and then add on what you need for other standards, or the other way around. You use the other standard and then you add on what you need for the Copper Mark. And I think this is so important because we're seeing this puzzle and this kind of landscape that many of our stakeholders say it's increasingly difficult to navigate, right? You have responsible mining standards, you have responsible sourcing standards, you have regulatory compliance expectations. And so to us, making sure that we recognize these different systems, that we recognize the responsible mining standards, but that we also recognize responsible sourcing standards at the refining smelting level, right, where there's more regulatory drivers involved as well. All of that kind of allows our participants to demonstrate practices while using the system that they're most familiar with, that they're already engaged with, and really recognizing the hard work that our colleagues and partners in other standards are conducting as well.
Yeah, no, and you were mentioning in a joke that you were the baby certification out there, but you're learning very fast and you develop a very interesting framework. I looked into details into it. And by the way, we didn't want to have presentations and slides for this conversation, but I've asked the panelists to send me ahead of time the presentation of the different certification schemes. And so feel free to reach out to me if you actually want them to be shared and ask questions, as I was mentioning here. But one question I wanted to ask you, definitely the inclusion of the entire value chain of the commodity is essential here to try to make a case on ESG certification and provide a kind of leverage on the different levels, and we see that on battery metals. I'm sure Peter might actually mention this on the work that the World Gold Council does on this. But I had a very specific question maybe on for you in terms of when you look at ESG certification itself and obviously environmental social governance, how do you actually tackle maybe differently the environmental performance of different projects, which is a very specific set of competencies, engineer driven and others, to the social and governance certification and validation, and which kind of tools actually you could be implemented into that kind of due diligence and certification monitoring and reporting on those performance there.
Yeah, so I think first of all, there's increasingly linkages and an increasing understanding as well how closely the two are connected, right? Environmental rights tend to be, or are human rights as well. You can't really look at one bucket without touching on the other bucket, right? And I think that is increasingly the case across different companies and also along the value chain. So that understanding that you can't really separate environment and social. That's you're inevitably gonna have to link the two and understand how they interact. Just from a certification perspective, look, I think again, mining companies tend to already have been exposed to ESG discussions a lot longer than the further up you go in the supply chain, right? That the lesser there's kind of this comprehensive approach to ESG. And so again, I think to us, it's important to see, in some instances, we have very strong responsible sourcing systems, but not much in terms of environmental existing systems. In other cases, there's very strong environmental regulations, but there's, maybe not much has been done on human rights due diligence or on supply chain due diligence. In some cases, we have systems in place for everything, but they may need to improve or mature still as a company sort of is on its way to increase responsible practices. So again, that to us is why we looked at the landscape, saying we need to recognize what you have already in place. We need to recognize that we're talking sort of midstream in the supply chain. We may be focusing more in our assessments on the social side, and we may be able to rely on some of the environmental certifications that have been put in place. If we are at more the mining level, then maybe we look at everything, or maybe there is another standard that's already checked a lot of it. So again, fundamentally, I think the philosophy behind the copper mark is to say we have to be comprehensive in the issues that we address. We cannot pick and choose which topics we address. We do need to look at all ESG areas, because what's a hot topic today may, tomorrow is a different day with a different hot topic. But also we need to recognize where systems are already in place, and then we need to help complement and build on those to make sure that other areas are equally prioritized and risks are appropriately identified and managed.
Thank you. Maybe just before turning to Peter, you mentioned something interesting, which was on human rights due diligence and a series of protocols there. If you're interested, we actually done a specific webinar on, it was on our website. It's called Modern Slavery and Mining. It sounds barbaric, but it's because the first and key law is the 2015 British law on modern slavery, which actually tackles really issues of human rights into the chain of supplies in different commodities. And so if some of the people in TENS wants to go on our website and just pick up that link, you have the views on different institutions, just back to Mines to Market or other organizations that provide some of the support in terms of the human rights due diligence. So happy to share this to you guys. And I'm turning, therefore, Peter, to you. I gave you like an extra 1 second to prepare. As you can see, I've had plenty of conversation with you guys at the World Gold Council on the importance of looking at supply chains entirely and involve different actors. What I was also very interesting to hear from you is especially obviously on the RGMPs, and if we have a little bit of history on talking about this, that can you maybe just as an introduction explain the RGMPs basically, and maybe build on this for to develop.
Sure. Thanks, Remy, and appreciate it. It's nice to be here with this panel. Great to talk about standards again. We have a lot to talk about, and there's a lot in common. Probably a lot more commonalities than differences among this group. That's for sure. So, World Gold Council. Let me tell you just a bit about that for your audience. It's a market development organization for the gold industry. So. It really is concerned about the demand for gold more than actually the supply, in fact. Conduct research and analysis and develop policy and support market infrastructure and set standards. So it's really kind of the global authority for the world gold supply and demand. Key stakeholders a little bit different, I think, maybe unique to some. Lots of institutional investors who deal with sovereign wealth fund, people who want to invest in gold, central banks, obviously the refining community, and the gold producers. That's 33 gold producers are the members of the World Gold Council, and they comprise the board of the World Gold Council. So the responsible gold mining principles were one of those standards that the World Gold Council developed. Basically, it covers 51 different areas of ESG. So like Michèle, kind of all of the issues are are covered and touched on. I think there's almost everyone that you could imagine for stakeholders might think of, and not a coincidence. We had a very extensive consultation. We don't have the same ongoing engagement stakeholder panel at the moment. That's something we're looking at, but because of that, the consultation was extremely extensive. We made sure that we had views, and actually it was super valuable to get input from different organizations across the value chain, from NGOs to national governments, international institutions, and investors. So that was really helpful in building out the robustness of the RGMPs. So they were launched in 2019 in September. And there's a 3-year time frame. So the 33 member companies are to this day and for the next while are working towards implementing them across 100 plus mine sites around the world. The RGMPs are focused on large scale gold mining. So this is not an appropriate set of principles or standard for the artisanal sector. And that's important distinction. And it's a condition of membership for World Gold Council members. And then that 3-year compliance is reaching next year for reporting in the following year. So, and the compliance, full conformance requires an RGMP report on, how you've done, where you've reached compliance, where you haven't, where there's some challenges, timelines for falling into place, et cetera. And of course, I think we know that any credible standard these days has to have some sort of independent assurance. So we have that. That was a fundamental part of what we wanted to do, to make sure there's an independent review at the mine site level, as well as up to the corporate level, to make sure what is reported and the performance is verified on the ground. So that's the focus. We in terms of Michèle, we asked the same question. I think everybody asked the same questions, at least the latecomers. Why do we need another standard? And for the commodity specific standards like the gold or copper, I think again there's a whole set of pressures, and you have different constituencies and different governance institutions that drive you towards doing something that's kind of focused on your skill set, your constituents. So we wanted something that was suitable to meet the needs of the refining requirements, so that looking at that full value gold supply chain, we wanted to discharge those responsibilities of the miner, and that hand in glove handover, we call it, to the refiner communities according to the LBMA responsible gold guidance. So that was a key driver. The importance of doing something specific for the gold industry and our members in particular, So we could highlight not only things that were unique to gold, like cyanide management, artisanal gold mining and interactions with artisanals, but things that we wanted to actually either we recognize as needing improvements, or we wanted to highlight ourselves. And a couple would be, workplace diversity is a key principle in the RGMPs. Taxes and transfer pricing, something that I think more disclosure on a company's perspective would be advantageous. Something, and so there's a couple areas where we think, let's highlight areas which we think we can improve on and have a more progressive stance on.
Yes, and I assume, I mean, on this, just maybe to complete and ask you how it was put together. I know there was a lot of work done on the mapping of the sustainable development goals, and I agree with you that some specific commodities have a very specific, print on the impact that they have on the territory, and the impact that it has when you map the SDGs to those operations in terms of gold mining. Obviously, the security aspect to potential criminal groups or artisanal miners. That's not specifically security, but you need to have a very specific approach to how you work with them. It's not the case in more base metals in that case. But can you just explain how you can map the SDGs to the RGMP and maybe integrate a common work when you actually do a lot of your sustainability reports, a lot of the decision making behind the kind of work, CSR work or development of capacities and transmission of knowledge to the communities also. And then I'll turn to Aimee just very briefly afterwards.
Yeah, it's a good question. And we just did a report on gold mining's contribution to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, released, I guess it was 2019 late, or maybe last year. Anyway, it was a number of case studies. We're actually collecting data right now that supports those case studies and shows the economic benefits that are built up and go to the national governments, and the actual impact, especially for resource dependent economies, how massively important it is for their tax base, for them to pay their civil servants, and they need to fund the SDGs in national at the country level. So mining is obviously a major source in many countries, a major source of that financing, of that tax revenue. So it's super important. I mean, the RGMPs, a lot of them talk about promoting the benefits, but frankly, and I reread that SDG report, and Lisa Saxon, the forward from Columbia University, she basically said, look, the first thing is you have to do no harm, right? Before you start talking about the positives, you have to make sure you get the no harm bit right. And the RGMPs, a lot of the way they're structured is basically saying, look, these are the issues we have to manage and manage well in order for us to not have a negative impact on the SDGs. And if we do so, we're actually going to start having a much more net positive benefit to not only to national governments through the taxes, but all those local benefits through employment, indirect employment, community projects, suppliers, which is the biggest number, frankly.
Yes, it's a great thing that you mentioned the word that is on Columbia University. I was about to send the recording to Lisa, so she'll smile when she listens to this, obviously. But turning to Aimee, I think what's very interesting what you bring to the table at IRMA is, as some of these certification that's very much inspired by the industry and pushed by industry, you actually have maybe a larger range of actors that you connected with that have inspired maybe IRMA. Maybe very much like Ambilieu Advisory, you have an outreach to NGOs and to academic institutions and other, and not only focus on being driven by the industry. Can you explain what that means and what that entails in terms of the assurance framework that you have, and also in terms of some of the key companies that I've seen listed? I was very happy to see Anglo American and ArcelorMittal, two very good companies that we know well, to actually be part of IRMA. How they actually contribute or sign off to those this framework.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Remi. One advantage for me in following these other speakers is I can draw on so many of the interesting points they've already made as well. And Michèle spoke to this role of law in governance and governments and legal compliance. And, all that we all are doing here is never going to replace that importance, and it can be a model for greater environmental and social protection that governments do. But those rules that everyone needs to follow that aren't voluntary are so critical. And the idea here, though, is can we create greater expectations for that? Can you support the role of government? Most governments are holding so much weight in looking at economic value and how does environmental and social either contribute or compete with that. And so this is really efforts to make that clearly contribute and complement, and to create consistency globally in that expectation, so that the rights holders and communities that Ben spoke to earlier, as they ask for better performance and have higher expectations and express their frustration with performance of a company in one place, how does that not just shift and squish out the problem someplace else in the world that feels less able to have that resistance? So that can be the value of consistent global standards. I don't think, in a few years, we'll be talking about so many standards. We'll be talking about so many forums in which consistent expectations are held, whether that's the copper sector, the gold sector, regional forums like Ben's talk around country expectations. But to answer the question you asked me there, Remi, so 14 years ago, there were diverse stakeholders having this conversation that Michèle talked about, the whole mine to market, and that so much of the focus had been on end products. In part, that was because I think communities affected by mining, when they had those frustrations, they might take them directly to a mining company in their region, but because that company was so far from an end consumer and somewhat insulated in that market spotlight, that could really be, in many ways, that performance could be underground and in the dark. This connection of mine to end products, whether that be the auto sector, electronics, jewelry, building materials, et cetera, is really trying to make the connection, the consistency all the way through. And so that's where IRMA's first came. There were purchasers of mine materials saying to NGOs, look, we're being held to account by you and by mining affected communities and rights holders for what happens in the ring, in the car, in the phone, on its way to this point. And we want to lever back the accountability to the mine level, but then help create that value throughout that supply chain. So IRMA is now, from that decade plus of work, the most comprehensive and rigorous standard that describes a shared definition across stakeholder groups of what would be responsible mining. It's the only global initiative on mining which is equitably led by civil society, where mining affected communities, NGOs, and labor have equal voting power at the table of governance, and to set the standard and the rules for auditing alongside the private sector. And the work that that Peter and Ben and Michèle are each doing, and then taking increased expectations and holding them to account within their memberships is really important work to help make sure that this is really infused, so that when the industry meets in rooms together, when the doors close, that expectation is held in there amongst peers as well out in the world. But it won't replace the need for an independent third-party multi-stakeholder oversight of that, whether that be government, which is the most ideal manifestation of multi-stakeholder, of shared definitions, but also an initiative that could be voluntary like IRMA. IRMA in some ways is more like the Forest Stewardship Council or Marine Stewardship Council than an industry trade association, but our work is close with the industry trade associations as we really try to bring this to something that feels clear to mining companies and in their associations, that it's driving value for them, that this is not just an added expectation.
I was about to ask a question to Michèle afterwards on independent third parties assessment on site and best practices. But before I turn to Michèle, I just wanted to follow up on something that you said in terms of involving more of the downstream players, the different actors along the line, and the ones that use the mineral. And I've across the different conferences that we've been, whether at Indaba or IMARC, and I think I've met you there very, very briefly also. The discussion of how you could actually incorporate, or how you can actually include them into this conversation, especially in battery metals, looking at decision that from Tesla to Samsung to Renault to different companies. How do you actually integrate all those views from different stakeholders to have it still implementable by mining companies? Because the problem with having multi-stakeholders and multi-views is that you actually very much gaining granularity in terms of methodology and in what you demand, but it becomes much more complicated to actually then be able to apply at a mining site. And that will transition to the third-party assessment at the mine site to Michèle. It's working fine.
Well, you have a lot there. I mean, you're right. There's this complexity. I remember a colleague of ours who was at ArcelorMittal, who I think everyone here knows, though, too, Alan Knight, who would often say there are many things that are complicated, but still beautiful. Your phone is complicated. It has more than 40 mine materials in it. It still does all these beautiful, amazing things once put together. So I don't disagree with you on the complexity there, Remi. Even each of us talking about mine level performance, when from an investment community perspective, you're often interfacing with a company, not a site. But for the affected communities, they very much want to look at performance on the site and not just see aggregating across, which can really hide some of those impacts. But I think aware of that, and because there are so many different stakeholders there are these ways to look at lenses on both. The Responsible Mining Index and from the European context, looking globally, for example, comes at looking at these issues from a company level. It's a nice cross-reference to what's happening at the site level, where that accountability really does need to be held. And I think it was Michèle who earlier raised the issues of due diligence, that this responsible sourcing, understanding your due diligence as a purchaser downstream of what are you complicit in throughout the chain. Then this is really about generating information, so you don't just hand out to proxy your own due diligence. You need to know that, but it's generating that information so you can go deeper and have a rich, the IRMA audit reports are 100 pages. You can really dig in and say, okay, our company is in particular in our responsible sourcing committed to greenhouse gas emissions or worker health and safety, or to the gender justice issues that Peter mentioned. So you can really go deeper into that content. That accountability is only going to grow right now. The distrust that has existed between mining affected communities and NGOs with the mining industry has not waned in recent years, although the profusion of conversation about these issues has increased. If anything, because of the increased mining pressure that goes to the renewable energy sector right now, in the sense that that's only going to increase, if anything, that tension has increased and accountability will need to go with it.
Yeah, and we see obviously here the aspect of due diligence and making sure that we have responsible supply chains in minerals. We see the pressure both from the international conferences and the end players and the communities at the same time. So there's obviously both very powerful drivers towards pushing for more sustainability and better practices. And then that turns to how you actually assess them on the site level. You see me coming, Michèle. I mean, obviously all these data that should be collected and if possible, not too much in a systematic way, because there needs to be an on-site level, a very specific, understanding of the site. Obviously, in a systematic way in terms of the categories and the processes. How do you advise for good assessment on site? I've seen that you have new partners that have signed in, especially in Peru with Condestable and others. All the Peruvian sites are very unique in terms of their issues and how they could provide insight on some of those reporting, ESG reporting. How do you advise them to conduct sound on-site assessment?
It's a great question, and again, lots of interesting points have been raised here before. There's a lot of different aspects to doing a good on-site assessment, but maybe to start thinking about this, the site assessment is one very important, but only one small part of the work that we do. Right, it's a snapshot in time. It will always be a snapshot in time. It's a tool to understand the practices as they happened at the moment that the site visit took place. Right, it is not going to replace other tools. To Aimee's point as well, right? Other tools in the company's due diligence toolbox, other tools in the company's toolbox to understand, to build trust and relationship with their communities. You cannot replace that by a site assessment. So I think that just has to be sort of stated at the outside, at the upfront, in terms of where the site assessment fits within the objectives that as standards we're trying to achieve, and what we're trying to where we're trying to go over time. Now, the other thing I would say is, this is a massive industry as well. The site assessments are by no means a new profession. There's established methodologies, established professional codes of conduct and certifications, and people and firms who've done this for a very long time. So as is the case in the responsible mining standards space, right? We also need to look at what are the established methodologies, what are the established, qualifications, competencies, experiences that we're looking for in terms of the assessors, and how do we potentially, strengthen that, build capacity when it comes to specific contexts, specific expectations in mining, in metal production, etc. So basically, how do you complement the auditing skill or the assessment skill with the subject matter expertise that's required in understanding the industry that you assess? And so I think a good assessor will always, come with a good set of competencies and experiences and skills. It will always, go by a sound methodology in terms of how performance is assessed or how management systems are assessed. And there's different ways of doing that. And at the end of the day, I think it's a lot of it is going to depend on making sure you have the right assessors, and that again they come with this backpack, if I can put it that way, of skills. Interestingly, also to me, the on-site assessment, there is always different elements to that, right? There is always the need to engage with internal, as we call them, internal stakeholders, external stakeholders. So you can't just speak with management. You obviously need to get an understanding in the sense of perspectives from other stakeholders that sit outside the mining company, that are part of indigenous peoples groups or communities, local authorities, etc., unions. So that's all part of assessing. I wanted to just touch base maybe on 2 or 3 in my view, sort of interesting trends that feed back to the due diligence and responsible sourcing conversation, right? I think one is sort of, we're seeing a lot of discussions happening and a lot of good conversations around the extent to which we can rely on these judgments by assessors, right, in the form of certifications and assessment reports, and the extent to which the assessor is essentially providing another data point that can be used in the due diligence. And so then the question becomes, what is the data points that we're looking for from these assessments, right? What is the thing that we're validating? What is the data that we're validating? And, can we trust that judgment? Or are we looking for the assessor at the end of the day to just collect data, not so much validate it, but collect data that can then be used by a customer or by an investor to come to their own conclusion as to whether that meets a certain performance or not? So I think it's certainly still a very kind of active and dynamic conversation around where these assessments are going and what is really the role in these due diligence exercises. And then secondly, I think we're seeing some big thinking around on-site versus remote, and that's just, COVID induced thinking. It has forced us to have another look at, what are the kinds of things where we really have to have boots on the ground? What are the kinds of things that you cannot assess over Zoom? Versus, what are the areas that you may not really need to fly somebody all the way from, Australia to Peru, so the remote assessments part, I think is again, it's a big conversation around to what extent can we use technologies to help inform these assessments, to get expertise into the room, even if that expertise isn't physically and personally represented. And linked to that, I think the constant need to have more local capacity. We're still seeing a lot of international experts in this space that are being, that travel all around the globe to visit mining projects. And we're still seeing sort of an opportunity there, I would say, to improve and to strengthen more local assessor to really have more of an ability to work more locally in this space.
Great, Michèle. I want to turn to Ben on another, ESG best practices. But before I do, I need to thank you on bringing up the issue of data point and being able to try to be able to assess the relevance of how it's brought about. We actually we'll have a webinar specifically on this issue on November 4th. We have a partnership with Citizen Lab in terms of being able to provide, different platforms to be able to collect some of this data from a crowdsourced perspective, and we'll explain this in November. And that's definitely one key element in terms of trying to be able how to assess remotely or on site, especially for companies in Canada. Maybe that gives me my transition to you, Ben. I mean, I remember one of the leading companies. They won't mind if I actually mention their name on this Agnico Eagle, which is also try to develop TSM in Mexico. I had conversation with them in terms of how to have remote assessment of work on their properties in Nunavut. How do you do this when you have to go through not only a quarantine when you arrive to Canada and then another quarantine when you go to another province? That's I mean, Nunavut is wonderful as a country, but as a place, but if you actually need to come out of 14 days in a hotel, then to actually be able to go to Nunavut, you might have a very kind of shallow life in some aspect, not being able to do a lot of work. So how do you actually see maybe some of the best practices of the Canadian actors so far in terms of being able to gather better monitoring or put in place better policies that you would recommend, especially Ben, that could be of interest to other mining companies here, or that could be of interest to investors that are looking for good properties that understand clearly this importance of ESG and increasing importance to it?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I guess to begin with, around the implications of COVID and the challenges of getting to site, there's been a lot of learnings, I think, for us and for all of the standards. We typically, historically, have not required a site visit for our audits. We place the expectation on sites that if your obligation is to be able, in terms of the assurance process, is to be able to convince the verifier that you've satisfied the criteria, to show the evidence, and that can be done. I mean, I think it's easier to do that. In fact, we have experience. Most of our sites do site visits as part of the assurance, but not everyone. And we have experience where we've had companies come to us after not doing a site visit and say, look, this was way too difficult. We really struggled to show the evidence, and next time we would make sure they come to site. And we've had other sites that say, look, we just make sure our documentation is up to snuff. We make sure that the auditor has access to the people, the communities, and the company representatives, the workers that they need to gather the evidence. And we just take the view that if we can't satisfy the verifier remotely, we won't take credit for something, and just mark us as not having met that criteria. So that has helped. I think that has helped us navigate the last year and a half with not being able to do site audits without having to make too much in the way of adjustments. Though we did give some companies leeway to extend their verification last year that would have preferred to have site visits. In terms of practices and processes, it's an ever evolving space. I mean, one of the important things about I think all of the standards at the table is that we're all committed to continuous improvement. And what that looks like in TSM, having launched 15 years ago, the standards that are in place today are not the standards that were there back then. And we have instances like in community engagement. Our members hit 100% of level A or better in the standard a couple of years ago, just as we were introducing a new standard that better reflects today's expectations around communities and people. And some of the things that we're looking at in that area, just to provide you an example, are a much greater focus. The first iterations of the standard were really focused on making sure that you had engagement systems in place and that you were listening to communities. Today, those expectations have increased to not only do you have these systems in place, but that they're developed with the community so that it's a true two-way path. And so, I mean, I could go through each. I don't think you really want me to go through each of the standards and give examples right now, but I think it's fair to say that the modern standards that we have in place today have evolved over the years and reflect exactly what is needed. And that's one of the reasons TSM, I think, has been successful, in that it is a more detailed level of standard than most, comparable or similar to IRMA in the areas that we cover. And that is a result of pressure from our members and from communities to be more specific, to make sure there's less interpretive room, and try to be a little bit more prescriptive around what companies should have in place, leaving the how they can do that, how they can satisfy those more detailed requirements, to give some discretion to make sure that companies and communities can work together to figure out what works best for them.
And perfect, thank you. And maybe turning to Aimee to complement this, when we talk about engaging better with communities, when we talk about including more stakeholders to both the definition of potential ESG strategies, the CSR project, the selection and the implementation, and the monitoring of it. How do you actually recommend to better integrate those stakeholders into the reporting, into the definition of also those policies? Because at the end of the day, the objective is to be able to integrate the project into a common objective for a territory and be a vector for more investment and more value in terms also of ESG. So how do you work with those?
Well, I think there's a few basics in building that community engagement. One is having the standard say, as the IRMA standard does, all through it. When communities ask for information, the answer should be to provide them information. So it's not just they're looking to the audit report to see what's happening at the site, is that if the community is calling the company saying, I'm worried about the downstream water quality, can I see the water monitoring data? The answer is yes. Here's water monitoring data. I mean, we also say if the community needs to hire technical support to understand and interpret that water quality data, that they are given funds from the company to help hire their own independent supporting technical support to sort through what does that data mean for them. So, but in the audit itself, then affirming that all the more that transparency is key, and we are moving to a moment of radical transparency for the mining sector. It came to agriculture, it's come to seafood, forestry, the garment sector. This is the moment for mining. It feels scary for many, I think, because mining has massive impacts. So we're not going to be able to just walk in and say the average copper mine, gold mine, iron ore, now lithium is an extraction project with no impacts. We leave it just as good as we found it. These are massive projects. Some are leaving decades, if not centuries, of impacts behind. It's time to speak really frankly about the footprint, which is such an inappropriate word for the level of impact that our current consumption takes. But to be honest about that, industrialized societies are using these materials every day. We're not having this moment of talking about peak copper. We're talking about using more of it in renewable energy. And so it's time for a really frank conversation about what we are complicit in that and who carries that weight greatest. And one of the ways to do that with these communities, to engage them in the process, is to say an audit is happening. And this is what we do before we do an audit. As community, you can participate, NGOs, you can participate, whether you live near or you live far, and then to make a robust, detailed, lengthy audit report on that available also publicly afterwards, so that the conversation that Michèle spoke to about it not just being a snapshot in time, but a community can go through it and get a sense of, like, at that moment in time, that's what was happening. But if something now is different 3 months later, or if an auditor either missed something or chose to miss something, that's called out and brought there. Only when we get to that level of trust will we start to move to a community's better understanding of what's happening on the site, confidence that what they are told is actually reality, and that what's happening there isn't in direct conflict with the other resources and realities they need to live with in that region.
No, and I completely agree, obviously, on the need for more transparency. And by the way, if anyone wants to go deeper, there's a publication, Resource Global Network had a recent publication. That's actually, you should read it because Michèle is interviewed into it. So at least for this, you should read that publication. But we also wrote a piece on including more transparency and how to streamline this in terms of S&G for the ESG assessment, specifically in Latin America. But obviously, the tools are there for having more transparent dialogue. The capacity and new methodologies are there. Then obviously, it's a question of, it's complicated to bring more transparency in areas where there's a lot of history of conflict. And I'm by past working in the Middle East, I could attest for it, or in a series of countries where you have very conflictive situation in Peru, in Mozambique, 2 areas were very, very active. And so you need to have the right protocol to be able to bring transparency and to facilitate and encourage people to be able to have their voice and pass beyond sometimes a series of limitations or obstacle bordering public participation at public hearings or other events. So there's plenty of ways. I mentioned Citizen Lab, other platform that you might want to look into it, into facilitating this dialogue and being able to pass information, comment it, discuss it, bring on board the experts, and facilitate inclusion of community actors to discuss about it, and therefore deconflictivize. I don't even know if that isn't even an English word, but you reduce the level of conflict of an area, and therefore implement those those methodologies and tools that will facilitate this dialogue, this transparency on the ESG theme. And that's absolutely needed and necessary for the social license to operate of the project and the impact that it will have also for the whole industry. I'm realizing I need to turn to you, Peter. Help me just maybe trying to wrap this up onto the different schemes for ESG certification. I mean, I trust your instinct in helping me bringing to the concluding thoughts afterwards. I was so interested into this conversation, I didn't even realize we're almost out of time. So here you go, Peter. Can you help me just try to knot this up together and I'll conclude afterwards?
Well, look, I think I'm happy to do that. I think Aimee said it very well about consistency, right? And I see a big shift in the industry in the last. I'm not sure how many standards there were 5 or 10 years ago, but you didn't have calls on a regular basis discussing, the pros and cons of this versus that and how they interact. So there's a lot of work being done on equivalency. There's a question I saw related to the confusion and can we simplify that? And we hear that all the time. And the work that we're doing on equivalency and cross recognition, each organization I think is got efforts which recognize others, is helping at least the mining companies implement that in a more efficient way and helping build confidence with external stakeholders that these standards are moving and starting to converge. And I think convergence and consistency, I think it's kind of the longer term. We need to apply this across more mine sites across the world. So when we introduced the RGMPs, we actually, strangely and unexpectedly, we got quite a few new members join the World Gold Council, partly because of the RGMPs, and partly other reasons. But now we're seeing other non-members applying the RGMPs. There's more and more, whether it's the RGMPs or IRMA or TSM or the Copper Mark, there's more and more companies around the world applying higher standards. And that's a good thing. And it's a good thing. And it's also an absolutely necessary thing. Companies don't have any choice anymore. The market is moving in a direction that's unstoppable. They're being, governments are holding companies accountable. Communities are increasingly, and investors. The market is not going to accept a company that doesn't have an ESG, a good ESG track record measured by any number of these standards. So I think overall, I feel very confident that it's a good, will we get to one standard? I'd love to see us set out a 5 to 10 year time horizon to converge on a higher standard. And because, expectations are increasing, and a one standard to simplify it for stakeholders. I think that would take a lot of flexibility and will on, because we all have different governance structures, but it's something to aspire towards.
No, absolutely. And I hope this conversation has led to, facilitate those discussions between those standards and also answer some of the questions from, different people in the attendance. I saw that, and first of all, thank you also to the panelists for answering the questions that were in the chat. I saw there was from Aimee, and I see her typing, so I know David Clare is going to receive an answer, especially I think it's regarding, probably who David is. There's plenty of ideas of ways to answer to David on this. But I just want you to, maybe finalize this conversation by, as I was saying, the people around this panel, as you can tell, are very good experts, but I can vouch for also very great individuals. So if you have any questions, I assure you that we will relate to them, and I know that they will answer also, facilitating the implementation of those, ESG standards and certification schemes and assurance schemes into around some of the properties and projects that you have. I wanted to thank you again for your presence. We will, as I say, provide a video recording and a transcript to this, and as I just really want this conversation, we had very interesting, preparation talks ahead of this panel. We'll probably have a full talk on to each of you, because I already have some ideas on whether it is, on data collection or some of the more community-driven indexes and certification scheme. But I want to thank you again for being there, and I wish you, all of you, a very good end to the week. I'll be in Colorado for the Denver Gold Forum and the Beaver Creek Precious Metal Summit for anyone that might be there interested in continuing that conversation or any conversations. And I'm looking forward to having you on a bi-weekly basis. Thank you very much, everyone, and I wish you a very good end of day.